this video, we will be doing an initial test after you have received your Nesi board. This test will check to see if your Nesi board, with a pre-loaded program, can blink an LED once a second. To complete this test, you will need to solder part of your Nesi board. If you haven't done so already, please check out the videos on the Getting Started page to learn how to solder and other techniques that you will need. Make sure your soldering iron is on and it is set to 400 degrees Celsius. You will then need to take your soldering iron and tin the tip with some solder. To do this, you will need to wipe it off, apply a little bit of solder around the tip, not too much, and then rub it off. This will provide you with a nice clean tip with no impurities to harm the joints that you create. The first thing we're going to be soldering is the USB connector to your Nesi board. What you're going to do is you're going to take your USB connector and place it into your board. Make sure that you tin your tip so there are no impurities left on your soldering iron, and then brush off the excess solder. When you go in to solder the USB connector to your board, make sure you apply heat to the board, pad, and to the pin that you are soldering simultaneously. Then you allow it to heat up for a few seconds. Make sure you go around the joint in a conical shape so that it makes a nice, thorough joint connection. Once you finish, you have your USB connector added to your Nesi board, and then you can move on to your next component. The next component we will be soldering is a switch. It goes directly above the USB connector, and we will place it in the board. You can place it any way, there's no polarity on this switch. Once you place the switch on the board, you're going to want to turn the board over so that you're able to solder the pins to the board. Remember, if it's been more than a few seconds, you need to tin your tip again to remove any of the impurities off of your iron. Move around the joint to produce a nice conical shape, and then move on to the next one. You have now completed your switch. Some experiments will need the use of LEDs, while others will not. If you do not need to use LEDs in your experiment, then for the purposes of this test, you will just take your LED, make sure you have the short end, which is the negative, put into the side with the thicker band, and make sure it is bent slightly so that it is touching the sides of the pad. This way it is making a connection and will be able to blink once a second. And then go ahead and do the same with the other color, the red one. But make sure they are touching the side, so make sure they are bent slightly. If you are going to use LEDs in your experiment, then go ahead and watch the next portion of the video, which will teach you how to solder the LEDs into your Nesi board. The next component we are doing is one of the two LEDs. Remember, you have both blue and red, so make sure you grab the correct one. On an LED, there's an anode and a cathode, which means positive and negative. The negative terminal is the one with the shorter lead. This LED is blue. So we will place it in the area on the board that designates the blue ones, which are the outer LEDs. You need to make sure that you place the shorter one facing inside the board with the wider band by the pad. This will make sure the polarity is correct. Once your LED is in, you can flip it over and solder your component. Next, we will be doing one of your red LEDs. Once your component is in, flip it over. Once you have done that red LED, you have now finished soldering all the parts you will need to do your first test. Make sure you clip the excess leads off of your LEDs and the switch so that they do not cause anything to short. To actually test the preloaded program onto your board, you will need to use your USB to Type B connector. You will also need to have access to a computer. You'll take one end and plug the USB side into your computer, and then take the Type B connector and plug it into your board. Make sure it is fully in there. It'll usually make a click, so you make sure you have a secure connection. After that has been done, you're able to turn your switch to on, and then check to see if your LEDs blink. In this case, our LEDs are blinking, so that means that our test program was successful and that the components we soldered were correctly placed on the board. After you have successfully tested your Nesi board and proven that your LEDs can blink once a second, then you will need to move on to soldering the rest of the components. There are some parts that everyone will need to solder and some parts that you will need to solder only if you'll be using them for your experiment. The only thing that everyone else will need to solder is the programming header. It has a short side and a long side. The short side will go through the board and the long side will be sticking out on top, and that is what you will use to plug your programmer into to program your microcontroller on your board. So we'll take that and place it in the programming header right here. Once you have flipped it over, you're going to want to solder it. Make sure to tin your tip again, brush it off, and then solder one of the pins on your header. After that one's done, flip your board back over and make sure your header is straight. In this case, it is good, so we do not need to fix it. Once you know that you have a straight header, you can flip it back over and then solder the rest. The following components are only to be soldered if you need them in your experiment. We'll start off by doing the rest of the blue LEDs. Make sure you take the negative end, which is shorter, and place it into the board on the top section where the thick band right here on the pad is thicker. That is the negative side. So place that inside your board. You can repeat for the rest of the remaining blue LEDs. Once you've soldered the remaining blue LEDs, you can move on to the remaining red LEDs. Remember, only do this if you need the use of the red LEDs in your experiment. The next component you will need to solder, if you need it, is the camera header. The camera header is very small, and you will be soldering it right next to the microcontroller on the board in the header here. You'll take your camera header, place it into your board. Again, you'll need to tin the tip. This sounds very redundant, but you must do it to clean your iron every time you switch onto a new component. And then after doing one, flip it over and check to make sure your header looks good. The last component you'll be soldering is your potentiometer. Only solder this if you have the use of the CO2 sensor on your board, because you will need the potentiometer to change your resistance level. The potentiometer is polarized. There's a little line in the bottom left-hand corner if you're holding it correctly. You take that line and you place it in the board where the plus is. Once you have clipped the rest of the leads off your Nesi board, then you should have a fully populated Nesi board for your experiment.